Are we just at the mercy of ghostwriters here? Are we having a candidate marketed to us who does not have these actual thoughts? Hello, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription with this video. We are going through something about the Kennedys, as we often do on this channel, not only, but often. We started this channel with a book about the Kennedys. We have read multiple books about the Kennedys, and we have recently been on a deeper investigation about the JFK assassination. This summer, our summer read is The Kennedy Men, 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets by Nellie Bly. And we have just gotten to the part where we are to John F. Kennedy pursuing electoral politics. So when I was reviewing, you guys, I don't know if this is nerdy or not, but I'm just going to tell you, I actually ended up making a spreadsheet of all of the old magazines that I have. I have quite a collection now of vintage magazines, and I wanted to have a reference so that when I'm out at an antique store, I can quickly make sure whether or not I have a particular print. And so anyway, as I did that, I came across this and remembered that I had purchased it. It is from July 4th, 1960. It's the Life special issue about U.S. politics. So we're going to dig right in to get familiar with the electoral mood of 1960. I really don't know fully what to expect from this. I don't know if it's going to be like a voter's guide. I don't know if it's going to contain all of the potential Republican slate and Democratic slate, or if by July 4th, I can't remember the dates of their conventions, if they would have already known that it was Kennedy versus Nixon. But we are going to dig right in. One interesting thing, it says there were no ghostwriters at the Alamo. And there's a whole front page here that says very soon the 2 great political parties of the United States will nominate their candidates for the president. One of these men, by a vote of the people, will be assigned the awesome duties of the White House, civilian leader of the nation, commander-in-chief of all of its armed forces, and keeper and director of its nuclear weaponry. Who are these men who seek the most formidable job, the most responsible job on earth? But more important, who is the one man, after the political merry-go-round has stopped, will hold in his hand the gold ring of victory? Do we know him? Have we ever known him? Will we ever know him? Who has written his speeches? Who or what board of ghostwriting strategists has fashioned the phrases, molded the thoughts, designed the delivery, authored the image, staged the presentation, put the political show on the road to win the larger number of votes? Then in smaller print, he says, who is the actor reading the script? Or in this moment, when eternity could be closer than ever before, is there a statesman who, for the sake of the vote, is not all things to all men, a man who will put America back on the high road of security and accomplishment without fear or favor or compromise? There were no ghostwriters, I'm skipping down a bit, at the Alamo, only men. Among them, Colonel David Crockett, who was 50 years old, Colonel James Bowie, 40, Colonel William Barrett Travis, 26. Interesting. And look at this. Oh, you guys, if you don't know, I am from Texas. What a beautiful print of the Alamo. It says the mission that became a fortress, the fortress that became a shrine. The Alamo, world premiere, October 1960. It says it's an advertisement, but what an opening advertisement in this particular edition. He is tying the Alamo and its glory and its bravery and honor to the potential of these 2 men and proposing, do we know either one of them? Are they both or one of them? Constrained by speech writers and image marketing rather than us really knowing the man. Well, here we have a quintessentially 1960 vision. It says how to plan your Independence Day. So there's advertisements. There's an old Ritz advertisement, plain or fancy. It says politics, a great game and a sight to behold. And it has 3 politicians there. It says, the propelling of a tyro into the arena seems to demand the sweeping gestures and seasoned oratory of an old pro. Old Glory, made out of Christmas ornaments, adorns the launching. Can you see that now? I was wondering, I thought it was just like old lights, but those are each Christmas ornaments. That's kind of a fun backdrop. It says the people who practice it call it a game, and it is superbly fascinating and risky. But politics is much more, a profession, a pathway to power, or, in the sweaty and often fumbling working of democracy, the essential step to statesmanship. Cynics practice it, so do idealists. Some of its methods are grubby, some circusy, but mostly they are ritual acts, tested and proved by time. There is only one excuse for baby kissing. It works. The aim, whether the Paul is a machine-backed hack or a machine-bucking amateur, is to win the votes. So that's how this article starts. We have the electorate to be won. We have people gathering in meeting halls, a woman playing the piano to play Stout-Hearted Men. That's being sung by these men to pep up the place. And then this says the quiet little caucus in the corridor. Politicians are forever having a caucus, a kind of huddle, whose name seems to stem from the Algonquin Indians. In a formal caucus, they may be considering the credentials of delegates or making an agonizing reappraisal of candidates. Such intimate huddles as this at Maine's Democratic Convention can give the first hint of changing allegiances and shifts in high strategies. It's interesting, only a couple, I believe 2, maybe 3 states do caucuses anymore as their means of selecting a candidate. But it is a very different process from primaries, where people just go and cast their ballots as they would in an election. In a caucus, there's a conversation with a vote. And then based on however the candidates do, they come together again and caucus, talk through, and that's where, like they said, like potential for shifting allegiances come more clear. Well, if it can't be Adlai Stevenson, then I would be willing to go behind this candidate. And those things would come out through caucus, and then they would have another vote and then show that these are not gaining enough sympathy, and so on and on until you come to the end where one person secures the caucus. There are pictures of buttons and crowds and handshakes. So that's the look of politics. It says silver-tongued men of few words who often outlast the listeners. That's that backlit photo, really beautiful. And then women there being campaigned to. They're all wearing flowers from Kansas, sunflowers that show that's where they come from. Oh my, what an interesting thing. It says, behind cloth curtain, the final decision. So that's talking about this image right here. When the tumult and the shouting dies away, the vital cog of democracy has its hour. Here in Milwaukee, a late voter completes her ballot as a lone cop stands clerk over curtained voting booths. And the poll watchers and election clerks, their vigil ending, can now prepare to count. Smile through a rude rebuff in red. Politics, even in these somewhat indifferent times, still stirs up passions. This Florida gubernatorial candidate knows, even on a poster, that you can't win them all. Old elections held in gymnasiums. Here we have Hoover, Eisenhower, and Truman pictured as the examples of the presidency at this point. Hoover says this: the presidency is more than executive responsibility. It is the inspiring symbol of all that is highest in America's purposes and ideals. So each one is giving a quote to remind the people what is involved in this job of the presidency. The copy down below talks about various scandals and challenges like the atom bomb, the Marshall Plan, Berlin airlift, Korea, being various issues that were dealt with. Now this one seems to indicate that we are down to Nixon and Kennedy. Let's read. Nixon waves a sparkler for the chorus of Hoop de Doodin' Doo in downtown Fargo, North Dakota. He was in state to support Republican Governor John Davis in bid for vacant senatorial seat. So there he is. That's actually perhaps the most handsome photo of him I've ever seen. One of the interesting things about the 1960 election is that it really was the first televised campaign. And so in contrast with these men, their reputations, not their images, were what secured the presidency. These men were not pin-up presidents. They were not, they had not drummed up support through marketing. They had done it through their merit. And so instead, what we have are these men who are playing to the camera. And here we have Kennedy. It says right here, it shows Northern Pacific. So Kennedy joins Congressman Quentin Burdick. So this is Symington. And Kennedy joined Congressman Quentin Burdick campaigning for Senate. Jennifer Burdick's age 16, stands between father and Kennedy. So this is the man he was going to support. Top men roll on to the conventions. The frenzy of brass band and fireworks, the gleam of campaign smiles did not hide the crisis that a handful of men had reached. For years they had planned and campaigned, journeyed long distances to satisfy their supreme ambition, the chance to run for the presidency. Now their own careers, and far more important, the future of the party and the country, lay in the fateful decision of the two great nominating conventions. On the Republican side, it seemed all over but the shouting. But the Democratic candidates, though one seemed well out ahead, battled on, unwilling to give up any last chance. So, Republican Richard Nixon, 47, Vice President of the United States, had served more effectively in that office than any predecessor. That's quite high praise. Since the beginning of Eisenhower's term, he had vigorously pushed his own candidacy, judiciously keeping his place as subordinate to the president while trying to make it plain that he was his own man. To the Democratic frontrunner, Jack Kennedy, the smell of success was tantalizing. In state primary after primary, he had licked anyone who dared oppose him. He gambled, persuaded, and pressured his way to control of delegation after delegation. But there was still the tense chance that rivals ganging up could frustrate him. He and all the other candidates, next page, were looking toward one man, Pennsylvania's political boss, Dave Lawrence, who had most of his state's uncommitted votes in his pocket. Yes, at this time, there was this reported smoke-filled room at conventions, and particularly the Democratic Convention of 1960, where previous conventions sometimes would do exactly that. A group of men would retreat into a smoke-filled room and hammer it out and fight and talk amongst themselves, similar to that process we just talked about caucusing. But it was the power players that met in that room and then emerged and told everybody else who the candidate was going to be. Well, primaries and caucuses had been held in 1960, and so it looked like it was a no-brainer. Kennedy, here, all the way to this side, was going to be the candidate. There we have LBJ, whose arms he's going around, and then Stuart Symington is there, as well as Adlai Stevenson. So let's read a little about each man. There is a scorecard here at the top, and it shows Kennedy having 666 and a half delegates at the first ballot of the Democratic Convention. Johnson, LBJ, who would, of course, be his vice president later, had 417 and a half, so that's fairly close. And then others and uncommitted were 297 and a half, and the others were a far back situation. So Jack Kennedy, youthful frontrunner, it says age 43, representative from Massachusetts from 47 to 53, senator from 53 to 60. As lieutenant, his PT boat was split by Japanese. He saved crewmen, was awarded medals for heroism. Despite frequent illness, which we've been talking about in our book that he tried to hush up, he has shown great drive, vigor as legislator. A Catholic, he has declared belief in separation of church and state. Co-author of Senate Labor Reform Bill, he has heavy union support. Would renew summit negotiations soon after election. Then Lyndon Johnson, the Senate master. Here's his description. Age 51, representative from Texas, 1937 to 49, senator since 1949. As the majority leader, he has record of sound leadership. Moderate in economic views, he appeals to businessmen. Supported in South despite his role in guiding 1960 Civil Rights Bill through the Senate. A master political maneuverer, he has more experience than all the other candidates as a legislator. Has stressed need for responsible bipartisan support on vital issues. And then we have Stuart Symington, who is a defense specialist from the Truman cabinet, and Adlai Stevenson. It says, labeled an egghead, he has had wide support among intellectuals. So those are the favorite four. And it says pros, rally to big time fight. So here we have pictures of the conventions. At the bottom is GOP. Here across the middle is the Democrat convention. And you can see the wonder and waiting on those men's faces as they consider candidates and go through the rallying Democratic process of trying to figure out who will actually take the cake. Now, even though there was discussion, Kennedy already had the majority there. He was ahead of the group. And yet, if all the others had combined their forces behind Johnson, I think Kennedy could have been unseated, but they didn't. It says the plots thicken. It gives some behind the scenes details of electioneering. There is Nixon checking his watch. Pocketbook pitch. It says general prosperity is shown by the rise of the GNP to a record $505 billion. Then we have the states. It says spotty depressions still exist in those red dotted areas. So the economy was an issue. There's a whole article here about prosperity and economic concerns and how each candidate saw those things. It says brimful bevy ready for big show. They are ready for the Democratic convention. We'll turn the page and see what that's about. Oh, how interesting. So they have a drawing of the battle ring. Look at this. It says the upper balcony, caucus rooms, convention offices, band platform. It's bringing us into the process and showing how it works. House trailers used for candidate offices, the press tent up there to the far left. This is all happening at Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena. At the center is the rostrum with all of the different states fanning out to different sides. There's Lawford, so that is Patricia, that is Kennedy's sister. There's Frank Church up at the top center. There are names of all different famous people. Mrs. Roosevelt is here at the bottom. She's quite elderly at that point. You've got Truman there in the center in between Missouri and Idaho. You have Bob Kennedy there in the Massachusetts portion. Here on this side, there's various other illustrious figures. So it's showing from all the states across the nation what was happening. Each state weighs in with its votes. Some, by law, were committed to a particular candidate. Some, by law, could be up for grabs with any given candidate, which is what they were talking about with the Pennsylvania delegation, that their votes were up for grabs. And so that means that candidates were vying for them, that there's discussions going on. You can see this map is fabulous. It says convention winners look at the U.S. map this way. This shows the Electoral College and the various sizes of states in regard to their actual voting power. So you see at this time, Pennsylvania was huge. It had 32 votes. New York, 45. Ohio, that nobody not that nobody thinks about it, but it is a much smaller state now and a much smaller amount of power. 25 votes at this point. Texas only had 24. California over here has 32. So you can see this is a look at, if you are not from America, you may not understand the Electoral College, but what it is sort of a combining of our House and our Senate so that both the importance of each state and their potential votes is acknowledged, but also the importance of populations and their importance is acknowledged. So in the Senate, every state has 2 votes, and in the Congress, it's entirely apportioned according to population. In the Electoral College, it's a combination of both. Whatever the total number of congressmen plus senators is for a given state, that's how many votes they have in the Electoral College. At this point, it gave clearly more power to places like New York and California that had exceedingly high populations compared to the central states. What it does now is force candidates not to only go to LA, Atlanta, and New York City to get their candidacy shored up, but they also have to go to places like Florida, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Texas, all around the nation, and actually hear from the people. So the point of the Electoral College is actually to balance out whatever source of power exists at a given time. And this map is a great example because the centers of power at this time were different from the centers of power now. And in any given time period, the Electoral College balances out competing interests so that hopefully the voice of the people is heard. So that is an interesting map that gives us a good look at that. We are given a look at certain politicians with their dogs. Right there is LBJ with his beagle. Different dogs with their owners. Hubert Humphrey is up at the top center. So different animals and their owners. Oh, how beautiful. My goodness, wouldn't you like that Plymouth there at the top? I would. I have a large family. I think old vehicles like that are just delightful. And you can see the children just hanging out in the back. Do you guys remember doing that? I remember road trips or even just going across town like after a softball game where the mom might let us lay out in the back and just look up at the sky while we were driving. And of course, nobody does that now, but those were fun times. Well, here we have the pomp and the glory. So there is a look back at what campaigns have looked like in the past and various presidents taking their oath. We have images of like Andrew Jackson here. So this is an attempt by Life to show the people American history, which is fascinating. Here we have Abraham Lincoln. It says gets set to rip. So here he is taking off his jacket, getting ready to speak to the people. So this is illustrations of old campaigns. Very fascinating, very lovely. I think we don't do this enough. Like this is educating the people in real time. Here's Woodrow Wilson hearing from the ladies in 1916. So it shows the women going to speak their minds to Woodrow Wilson. The images get updated. Here is New Deal years begin for FDR. You can see there in the bottom just the more modern look of even the artistry there. I love how old print media does this. Just gives us beautiful images to look at. It shows a photo of the lowly precinct. It says where it all begins, and it shows a district in Chicago, Chicago's Ward 31. All politics, the hoopla conventions, the high-sounding issues, the nationwide campaigns fall back eventually on the drudgery of men like the intense pair above. This is precinct captains Mike Patano and George Formusa, anxiously awaiting by Chicago polling station on primary day. Mike Patano is a Republican precinct captain. George Formusa is his Democratic opposite number. Neither is running for office. They are perpetual politicians locked in a 24-hour-a-day, year-round struggle to control the vote at the lowest level. They have their counterparts all over the country at work in the basic campaigning units, in precincts, in voting districts, sometimes even in individual blocks. So these men would go and they were responsible for getting out the vote, for getting Democrats or Republicans to the polls, and for making sure they knew who to vote for. Which candidate do we want for the judgeship? Which one are we pulling for? Which name am I supposed to vote for? Your precinct captain could tell you just in case you didn't know. So here it shows various people mulling the vote, getting talked to, thinking through their options outside of the polling locations. We're given a look at the lady from Minnesota. It says she brings charm, savvy to national committee job. I'm in politics, says Jerry Joseph of Minnesota, because it is a way of getting things done, good things. Mrs. Joseph is a party worker, but she functions at the opposite end of the spectrum from the precinct leaders just shown. A new Democratic National Committee woman, she is one of 2 Minnesotans who represent her state in national party councils. She is also the most radiant phenomenon to appear in a top political job in a long time. A handsome, intelligent, college-educated wife and mother, more interested in issues than the color of a candidate's eyes. At 37, she is a figure to be reckoned with and a delegate worth keeping an eye on at the National Convention. So these would be people that go on behalf of their states to represent the state's interests. It also shows her not only with big wigs pressing the flesh on this side, but with her baby. So it's showing she's a formidable woman at home and in party politics. The religious issue, an un-American heritage. Oh my goodness. So it's talking about Catholicism. And here under the Ku Klux Klan image, which is just striking, isn't it? It says Ku Klux Klan, major anti-Catholic force of the 20s, stirred hatreds lasting for years. Hooded members carried flags, flaming crosses. So it's discussing the issues of the Protestant Catholic lines that we have been talking about. People feared that Kennedy would potentially have more loyalty to Rome than to his countrymen. And so I'll read a little bit of this. It says, on the day last winter when he announced his intention of running, Senator Kennedy declared, I would think there is really only one issue involved in the whole question of a candidate's religion. That is, does a candidate believe in the Constitution? Does he believe in the First Amendment? Does he believe in the separation of church and state? When the candidate gives his views on that question, and I think I have given my views fully, I think the subject is exhausted. Well, that's a good answer. He points people back to the First Amendment, which allows for freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and freedom to follow one's conscience. And yet, he says also, does he believe in separation of church and state? Meaning not that religion can never carry any hold in our own personal convictions, but that the country cannot dictate to a human being what their religion ought to be. That was the original proposition of the Puritans leaving, because they didn't want to have to be baptized into this church or that church. They wanted to be able to have freedom of their conscience. And so he's saying it is fundamentally American that the state, the government, should have no sway on which form of religion I personally follow, nor you as my fellow Americans. So that's a good argument. It's very fascinating, you guys, and humbling, honestly, the degree of careful, precise political thinking that went into pieces like the one that we started with about the Alamo. The degree of historical politics that was presented through the articles about early politicians and their approach to electioning. And then this right here, as it's a whole discussion of Catholic Protestant history, the Puritan intolerance. Back it talks about the Massachusetts Puritans, Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had founded the first Baptist church in America after Massachusetts exiled him for advocating the separation of church and state, allowed Catholics full civil rights. Then it talks about the Catholic influx. Y'all, this is such a high degree of confidence in the average voter being expressed in these articles. Far greater than we expect of the electorate now. It's a bit humbling. Then we get a subheading of the rise and fall of the KKK. And so there's a whole discussion in the 1920s about the Klan and its relationship with Catholics. And then it says a trend towards tolerance. But now there's a peaceableness between most Protestants and Catholics. It says test of prejudice took place last May in West Virginia, where Kennedy, I'll hold that up where you can see it, won primary votes of non-Catholic minors. His sweeping victory indicated that labor vote may be more important in 1960 than religious vote. So very fascinating to see the very real ways that the country itself was grappling with these issues. Oh, how amazing. This shows very old, at the Smithsonian, mementos of candidates and issues of old presidential campaigns. Look at those various flags, dish sets, various mementos that had been used. It says 1896, 1913, all the way back to 1840, a Tippecanoe banner. It shows old torchlight parades that were for various candidates. It looks like holes were poked or flags were made that were held up in torchlight parades in the last century. That's very cool. I didn't even know about that. Did you guys? It says from Grant, there's a Civil War musket, there's a Prussian style marching helmet. Down here we have an eagle with torches coming out of it. Very interesting. I didn't realize that had been part of our history. Maybe I've missed that. Then there's the roll of buttons from Abe to Ike, it says. So it shows political buttons. That's very beautiful, isn't it? One of the last articles here says, this year, everybody cares. Politicians are warned, both issues and leaders count. Now, here I see a name. Do you see it? That we are seeing all the time in the Kennedy man, Arthur Krock. That is the man who, with the New York Times, was basically contracted with Joe Kennedy from the very beginning. Arthur Krock had carried water for Joe Kennedy way back during FDR's presidency. Here he is. It says the author of this article is the distinguished Washington columnist for the New York Times. In the course of his 50-year newspaper career, Mr. Krock has twice won the Pulitzer Prize. It's interesting. The whole front of this doesn't mention Kennedy or Nixon at all. It talks about political outcomes, pre-convention, post-convention, wheat acreage, administrative sacrifices, and Soviet Premier Khrushchev are all mentioned. So it talks about issues of the Republican Party and their interactions with Khrushchev. It actually mentions the U-2 overflights that were happening from Japan to Russia, which is interesting because that was the whole crux of the problem with Lee Harvey Oswald, that he had, theoretically at least, gone and released information that he was not authorized to do to Russia about the U-2 spy incident. He does say here in the middle of the article, he says the ideal leader would be a citizen of whom a historian in a later generation could write as follows. A series of fortunate circumstances had made it possible for him to be elected president in 1960 without being driven to unattainable commitments. He thus had earned the gratitude of a majority of Congress elected at the same time because he had enabled it safely to follow his example. Once in office, he established himself with informed critics as a qualified judge of the requirements of military defense, with the capacity and will to unify the armed forces, as a source of new ideas which led to the reduction of world armaments and to a more effective foreign aid program, as a restorer of good relations between the United States and the people of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, when, through these accomplishments, fruitful negotiation of world tensions with the communist powers became possible, he demonstrated skill and resourcefulness. And it goes on. He talks about, and this is supposedly, even though we know he's a very close contact of Joe Kennedy, supposedly this is his unbiased view of what a president ought to be, whether it's Nixon or Kennedy. He doesn't actually mention either man as far as I can tell, which is fascinating. Then we are given a quick look. It says collegians, yuck it up. So it shows the youth vote, which did start to have a sway at this time. Of course, this was the era post-World War II when there even was a young vote to be had. Prior to that point, people hadn't really looked much to teens and young adults for much of anything, but now they are having sway. Here we have a co-ed for Nixon. Look at her little hat there, Nixon for president. It says, Mary Whiteside checks her hat angle. A member of the Florida delegation, she first voted for Senator George Smathers. But when her delegation threw over the unit rule, she switched to another party and voted for Nixon on the second and final ballot. That's interesting. George Smathers was a friend of Kennedy's. Well, anyway, we get our final cigarette ad there at the back, like we often do. Go to the mountain. It says Alpine filter cigarettes, fresh filtration. So there you have it. That is our look at the 19-cent Life U.S. Politics special issue of July 4th, 1960. You know, I do think the biggest thing that I notice about this is the indictment that it speaks against the modern voter, that we are not as informed, we are not as big picture or as detail oriented as these voters apparently were. They were willing to work through the various issues. They were willing to read long form content in order to understand their person. And they were willing to write these heralding articles and read these kinds of articles that called people to consider, are we just at the mercy of ghostwriters here? Are we having a candidate marketed to us who does not have these actual thoughts? Or are we getting men like we had at the Alamo? It's a very interesting question, a very deep question, and one that I think sadly leaves our modern era in the dust. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I love the look that this gave us at U.S. politics in 1960. And I would love to know what you learned or what you noticed or had never heard. As well as, are you going to join us for this book? And if you've already been joining us, how does this printing affect the way that you see the things that we were talking about in our books? Next time, we'll be back to the Kennedy men, as well as other related articles and investigations that we're doing into the JFK assassination this summer. I hope you have a great day. Take care. We'll see you in the comments. Bye.